The border station sat at the very edge of known space, far from anything that mattered to the people who made decisions. It was old. Its walls had rust spots that no amount of paint could hide, and half the lights in the corridors flickered at random hours of the night. The Galactic Union had built it 60 years ago, and then slowly stopped caring about it, the way someone might forget about a fence post on the far end of a property they never visited. Captain Jake Harris stood at the bridge window of his ship, the Pale Hound, and looked out at the stars beyond the station. He had been here for 3 years. 3 years of filing reports that nobody read, requesting supplies that never came, and training a crew that the rest of the fleet had written off as unimportant. Jake was 34 years old. He had brown hair that he kept short, because there was no good barber on the station, and he had a calm face that did not show much of what he was feeling. He had graduated from the Union Naval Academy in the middle of his class, not at the top where the glory was, and not at the bottom where people at least remembered your name for the wrong reasons. He was the kind of officer who did everything well enough that nobody noticed him at all. The Union had sent him to this post because they needed someone to sit at the border and watch the empty space beyond it. The empty space was not really empty. It belonged to the Verkari Dominion, an insectoid civilization that had been conquering star systems for over 200 years. They moved slowly, but they never stopped. Every species that had tried to fight them had lost. Every diplomatic mission had failed. The Verkari did not negotiate. They consumed. Everyone in the Union knew that one day the Verkari would push through this corridor. When they did, the border station and the Pale Hound would be the first things in their path. The plan, as far as Jake understood it, was simple. The border would fall. The station would be destroyed. And then, the real fleet, stationed in the core worlds 14 hours away, would respond with full force. Jake and his crew were, in the most polite military language, acceptable losses. He had 42 people under his command. 42 humans on a single frigate that was 2 generations behind the current fleet standard. His weapons officer was a sharp woman named Katie Morgan, who had been sent here after she disagreed too loudly with an admiral. His pilot was Danny Cole, a young man with fast hands and a nervous laugh, who had requested a deep space posting because he wanted adventure and did not yet understand that adventure and boredom often lived in the same house. His chief engineer was Nate Holloway, a quiet and clever man who could fix anything with enough spare parts and enough coffee. These were good people. Jake knew that. And he had decided very early in his posting that he was not going to let them be acceptable losses. He spent his first year studying the Verkari. He read every battle record, every intelligence report, every academic paper he could find. He learned how their hive ships moved, how their drone fighters swarmed, how their commanders thought. He ran simulations on the bridge computers late at night when the rest of the crew was sleeping. He lost most of those simulations. Then he changed his tactics and ran them again and again. In his second year he started modifying the Pale Hound. Nate Holloway helped him strip out systems they did not need and replace them with things they did. They improved the engines for short, fast bursts of speed. They added signal decoys built from parts that Nate had salvaged from old Verkari probe wreckage that drifted across the border from time to time. They rewired the torpedo launchers so they could fire in patterns that no standard Union ship could manage. None of this was approved by headquarters. Jake filed the modification reports anyway, and as usual, nobody read them. In his third year he trained his crew until they could do things in their sleep that most Union crews could not do fully awake. They ran drills every week. They practiced emergency maneuvers, damage control, and combat scenarios that assumed they would always be outnumbered. Katie Morgan grumbled about the schedule, but she never missed a session. Danny Cole stopped being nervous and started being precise. The whole crew became something tight and sharp, like a blade that had been honed in silence where nobody was watching. Far across the galaxy, in a place so different from the border station that they might as well have existed in separate universes. Princess Elindra Vasharin sat in a hall made of living crystal and tried not to let her boredom show on her face. The Alanthi Star Sovereignty was the oldest and most powerful non-human civilization in the Galactic Union. Their cities floated above gas giants. Their ships moved through space like silver songs. Their culture was built on a single idea that went back thousands of years, that the truth of a person's soul could be seen most clearly in how they behaved in battle. Not whether they won or lost, but what their choices revealed about who they really were. Elindra was the eldest daughter of Sovereign Vasharin, which meant that one day she would rule. And before she could rule, tradition demanded that she choose a consort, a partner who would stand beside her for the rest of her life. That partner had to be chosen from among warriors who presented their battle records for her judgment. She had been reviewing suitors for almost a year now. They came from across the galaxy. Tall, proud Alanthi commanders with centuries of service. Clever Rithian strategists with records full of elegant victories. Even a few humans, mostly admirals and decorated captains from the core fleet, polished and political, and eager to make the right impression. Elindra read every single battle report with the skill her mother had taught her before she died. The Alanthi could read a battle record the way a musician could hear a symphony. Not just the notes, but the feeling behind them. Every tactical decision told her something. Every order revealed character. Every moment of crisis showed her the shape of a person's heart. And every report she read left her cold. They were not bad warriors, but she could see the calculation behind their courage. She could feel the ambition hiding inside their sacrifices. They fought to be seen. They fought to climb. They fought to win, not because winning protected anyone, but because winning was how they proved their worth. She wanted something different. She wanted someone who fought because the people behind them mattered more than the glory ahead of them. She wanted a soul that burned not with the desire to be great, but with the refusal to let others fall. She had begun to wonder if such a person existed at all. She did not know that on a rusting station at the edge of nowhere, a man she had never heard of was about to answer that question for her. The Vrekari were coming, and Jake Harris, forgotten captain of a forgotten ship, was the only one standing in their way. The alarms screamed through the pale hound at 3 a.m, station time. Jake was already half awake. He had not been sleeping well for days. Something in the long-range sensor data had been bothering him. Tiny fluctuations in the energy readings beyond the border, so faint that the automated systems had not flagged them. But Jake had spent 3 years learning to read the silence of that stretch of space. And silence that changed even slightly was not really silence at all. He was on the bridge in under 2 minutes. Danny Cole was already in the pilot's chair, his hands resting on the controls, his face pale but steady. Katie Morgan arrived 30 seconds later, her hair still wet, pulling on her jacket as she moved to the weapons console. Nate Holloway's voice came through the engineering channel before Jake could call him. "I see it, Captain. Engines are hot. Tell me what you need." What the sensors showed them was the kind of thing that belonged in a nightmare. 18 Vrekari hive ships were coming through the border. Each one was the size of a small moon, covered in organic armor that could heal itself, carrying thousands of drone fighters inside its body, like wasps inside a nest. Around them moved dozens of escort cruisers, faster and more agile, designed to screen the hive ships from attack. Behind them, in a cloud so thick it almost looked solid on the sensor display, were the drones, 10,000 at least, maybe more. A full invasion swarm, the kind of force that had swallowed entire civilizations. And between that swarm and 3 colony worlds holding over 2 million people, there was 1 old frigate and 42 humans. Jake stood at the center of the bridge and did the math in his head. Reinforcements from the core fleet were 14 hours away. The swarm would reach the first colony in 6. There was no one else. There was no trick, no loophole, no clever way around the simple truth of the situation. If he ran, 2 million people would die before help arrived. He did not run. "All hands," he said into the ship-wide channel, and his voice was calm and clear, and carried no pretense of false bravery. "This is the captain. A Vakari invasion swarm has entered the corridor. Full strength. There is no support within range. If we do not slow them down, the colonies behind us will not survive. I will not order anyone to do this, but I am going to fight. If you are with me, get to your stations." Every single member of his crew went to their station. Not one person hesitated. The battle that followed lasted 11 hours, and when it was over, military historians across the galaxy would spend decades trying to understand how it was possible. Jake did not try to fight the swarm head-on. That would have been suicide in the first minute. Instead, he used everything, every trick he had practiced in 3 years of simulations, every modification Nate had made to the ship, every hour of training his crew had endured. He started by running. He took the Pale Hound deep into the asteroid field that sat along the border corridor, a thick belt of rock and ice that most ships avoided. The Vakari followed. Their drones were fast, but the asteroid field broke up their swarm patterns. The drones were designed to fight in open space, moving in coordinated clouds that overwhelmed targets with numbers. In the asteroid field, those clouds kept crashing into rocks. Danny Cole flew the Pale Hound through gaps that should have been too narrow, spinning the frigate on its axis, cutting thrust and drifting, then burning hard to change direction. The drones that followed him died against the rocks he slipped between. While the drones chased them, Jake triggered the first of Nate's signal decoys. Small devices, no bigger than a person's fist, that broadcast energy signatures identical to a Union warship. He had planted them on asteroids during the past year, quietly, without telling anyone. Suddenly, the Vakari sensors showed not one enemy ship, but dozens, scattered across the field. The swarm split. 6 hive ships broke away from the main group to hunt the false targets. That was exactly what Jake wanted. He led those 6 hive ships toward the gas giant at the edge of the corridor. It was a massive planet, with a thick atmosphere of hydrogen and methane, and Katie Morgan had spent months calculating exactly how deep into that atmosphere a modified torpedo could travel before detonation. When the hive ships moved into the planet's gravity well, chasing what they believed was a fleeing enemy, Jake gave Katie the order. She fired a single torpedo with a modified warhead, not explosive, but incendiary. It dove into the atmosphere and ignited the hydrogen layer. The explosion was visible from the station's sensors, millions of kilometers away. A wall of fire engulfed the 6 hive ships. 4 were destroyed instantly. 2 managed to pull away, burning and crippled, their organic hulls screaming in frequencies that the Pale Hound sensors translated as pain. That was the 4th hour. Jake's crew was exhausted and running on adrenaline. They had lost 2 people, crew members named Vince Perry and Meg Saunders, when a section of the hull breached during a close pass through the asteroid field. Jake felt their deaths like a blade in his chest, but he could not stop. Not yet. He pressed deeper into the battle, using the confusion to strike at escort cruisers, picking them off one by one with ambush tactics. Danny Cole flew patterns that the Vakari could not predict because they were not in any tactical database. They were patterns Jake had invented during his late-night simulations, designed not for elegance, but for survival. By the 6th hour, they had destroyed 8 hive ships, but the toll was rising. 7 more of his crew were dead. Jake himself had taken shrapnel in his left shoulder from a console that exploded during a near miss. He ordered the medic to bandage it and stayed on the bridge. In the 9th hour, he made a decision that everyone on the bridge knew was insane. One of the remaining hive ships had positioned itself at the mouth of the corridor, blocking any path to the colonies. Jake ordered Danny to fly directly into the hive ship through a hull breach that Katie had blown open with a concentrated torpedo volley. The Pale Hound entered the interior of the living ship, flying through organic tunnels wide enough for a frigate, but filled with internal defenses. Nate rerouted all available power to the forward shields. Katie fired everything they had into the ship's internal organs. Danny flew with his jaw clenched so tight that he cracked a tooth. They came out the other side. The hive ship did not survive. By the time the Union relief fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel, 14 hours after the first alarm, the battle was over. 11 of 18 hive ships were destroyed or disabled. The surviving 7 had retreated back into the Vakari expanse, broken and disorganized. The corridor was held. The colonies were safe. The Pale Hound drifted in space, its hull torn open in a dozen places, venting atmosphere from sections that the crew had sealed off and abandoned during the fight. 13 of Jake's 42 crew were dead. 20 more were wounded. The ship would never fly again without a full rebuild. Jake sat on the bridge in a chair that was half melted from a plasma fire they had put out in the 10th hour. His shoulder was bleeding through the bandage. His ribs ached where a second injury, a plasma burn, had left a mark that would scar. Around him, his surviving crew sat or stood or leaned against walls, too exhausted to speak. Katie Morgan looked at him from the weapons console, her eyes red, her hands still shaking. Danny Cole was slumped in the pilot's chair, staring at nothing. Nate Holloway's voice came through the engineering channel, quiet and hoarse. "Engines are dead, Captain, but we're still here." Then he opened them, looked at his crew, and said, "Yes, we are." The relief fleet found them like that, broken but alive, surrounded by the wreckage of an Empire's invasion force. 42 people who had done something the entire galaxy had believed was impossible. The Union wanted a hero. Jake gave them a report. He wrote it himself, sitting in the medical bay of the relief fleet's flagship, while a doctor argued with him about lying still. His left arm was in a brace, his ribs were wrapped tight, and his eyes had the hollow look of a man who had not slept in 2 days. But he insisted on writing the after-action report before anyone else could shape the story. It took him 9 hours. He wrote it in the plain, direct language of a military officer, but there was something in the way he wrote that went beyond standard procedure. He did not begin with himself. He began with his crew. He wrote about Nate Holloway, who had kept the engines running for 11 hours through damage that should have shut them down in the first 2. He wrote about Katie Morgan, who had calculated the gas giant ignition on the fly and landed the shot on their first attempt. He wrote about Danny Cole, who had flown maneuvers through an asteroid field and then through the inside of a living ship without a single moment of hesitation. He wrote about every single crew member by name, including the 13 who had died. For each of the dead, he wrote what they had done and how they had fallen. He did not use grand words. He did not call them heroes. He wrote about them the way you write about people you loved, simply, carefully, making sure that nothing important was left out. When he came to his own actions, his language changed. He became shorter, almost blunt. He listed his tactical decisions and their outcomes without praise. And when he reached the part of the battle where 2 of his crew had died because of the maneuver he had ordered, a flanking pass that had exposed the portside hull to drone fire, he did not explain it away. He wrote, "The decision to execute a portside flanking approach at the 4-hour mark was mine. I believe the tactical advantage justified the risk. I was wrong. The loss of crew members Vince Perry and Meg Saunders was a direct result of my miscalculation. This failure is mine, and I will carry it forward." No commanding officer in the history of the Galactic Union had ever written something like that in an official battle report. Commanders took credit for victories and blamed losses on circumstances. That was how the game was played. Jake did not play the game. He simply told the truth. The report was filed through standard channels. Because the engagement was classified as significant, which was a dramatic understatement, copies were distributed to every member state of the Galactic Union. It traveled across the galaxy through diplomatic pouches and encrypted data streams, landing in military offices, government halls, and intelligence agencies on 100 worlds. Most of them read it with shock. Some read it with admiration. A few read it with jealousy. The military analysts picked apart his tactics with fascination, arguing over whether his strategies could be replicated or whether they were the product of a singular mind in a singular situation. But no one in the galaxy read that report the way Ailindra Vasharan did. She received it on a quiet evening. The crystal halls of the Sovereignty Palace were dim, lit by the soft bioluminescent glow that the Ailanthi preferred in their private spaces. Ailindra was in her study, surrounded by the battle records of her remaining suitors, a stack of reports she had been putting off because she already knew they would disappoint her. The human border engagement had been in the news for days, but she had not paid close attention. Humans were a young species. Their military was capable but unremarkable by Ailanthi standards. She expected the report to be a straightforward account of a lucky engagement, perhaps padded with the kind of self-promotion that she had come to expect from every warrior in the galaxy. She was wrong. She read the first page and felt something shift inside her, a feeling she did not immediately recognize because it had been so long since she had felt it. Interest. Genuine, sharp, hungry interest. By the third page, she had stopped breathing without realizing it. Her eyes moved across the words, and she saw what the Ailanthi were trained to see, not just the tactics, but the person behind them. Every decision Jake had made told her something. The way he had prepared for years without recognition told her about patience and dedication. The way he had used every resource available, no matter how small or unconventional, told her about creativity and refusal to accept limits. The way he had chosen to fight when running was the rational option told her about a moral core that was deeper than strategy. And then she reached the passage about his mistakes, about the 2 crew members who died because of his order, about the words, "This failure is mine." She set the report down and pressed her hands flat against the table. Her hearts, the Ailanthi had too, were beating hard. In all her years of reading battle records, she had never seen a commander take personal responsibility for losses in an official report. She had seen grief dressed up as glory. She had seen regret hidden behind tactical justifications. She had seen 1,000 different ways that warriors protected their image at the cost of their honesty. But she had never seen a man lay his soul bare in a military document and say, plainly, that he had failed the people who trusted him. That was not the mark of a good tactician. That was the mark of a great soul. She read the report a second time, slower now, paying attention to the small details. The way he credited every crew member, the way he described the Vrekari not with hatred, but with a kind of respect, calling them a disciplined and formidable enemy. The way he never once used the word "I" when describing a success, and never once avoided it when describing a failure. She read it a third time, and by the end, she was certain. She stood up from her desk, walked to the window that looked out over the crystal spires of the capital city, and spoke aloud to the empty room. Her voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of absolute conviction. I will wed this man. She did not sleep that night. Instead, she prepared. She reviewed Ailanthi law to confirm what she already knew, that the heir's choice of consort was sovereign and could not be overruled by anyone, including her father. She drafted her statement. She chose her words with the same care that Jake had chosen his, because she understood that what she was about to do would shake the galaxy. The next morning she walked into the full sovereign court. Every suitor was present. The Ailanthi nobility filled the crystal galleries. Ambassadors from a dozen species stood in the observation wings. Her father, Sovereign Vasharan, sat on the high throne and watched her approach with the careful eyes of a ruler who knew his daughter well enough to be worried. Ailindra stood at the center of the court, in the place where heirs had made their declarations for 10,000 years, and spoke. I have read the battle records of every suitor before me. I have searched for the soul that our tradition demands, a soul of courage, of honesty, of strength used not for glory, but for the protection of others. I have not found it among the candidates presented to this court. The hall went very quiet. I have found it in the battle report of a human captain named Jake Harris, who commanded 42 soldiers against an invasion swarm at the edge of Union space, and who held the line, not for fame or advancement, but because 2 million lives depended on him. I have chosen. I will wed this man. For a long, stretched moment, the court was silent. Then the silence broke like glass, and the sound that followed was something between outrage and disbelief. Suitors rose to their feet shouting. Nobles turned to each other with expressions of shock. Ambassadors sent urgent messages to their governments. Her father stared at her with an expression that mixed anger, confusion, and something that might have been reluctant admiration. Aelindra stood in the center of it all, calm as a stone in a river, and waited for the storm to pass. It did not pass quickly. Jake Harris found out the same way the rest of the galaxy did. On the news. He was sitting in the mess hall of the repair dock, where the pale hound had been towed after the battle. His arm was still in a sling. His ribs still hurt when he breathed too deeply. Around him, what remained of his crew was eating a meal that was slightly better than what they usually got, because the repair dock's kitchen staff had heard about what they did, and had decided to cook something that was not from a military ration pack for the first time in anyone's memory. The broadcast screen on the wall was running the galactic newsfeed. Nobody was paying much attention to it. Danny Cole was telling a story about something that had gone wrong with the artificial gravity during the fight, and Katie Morgan was laughing at the parts Danny was clearly exaggerating. Nate Holloway was sitting at the end of the table, quietly eating and reading a technical manual about engine components, because that was what Nate did when he was relaxed. Then the news anchor said the words, "Aelanthe Princess," and "Human Captain," and "Marriage Declaration," and the mess hall went silent. Jake had a spoonful of food halfway to his mouth. He stopped moving. The screen showed an image of Princess Aelindra Vasherin standing in the crystal court of the sovereignty, and below it, in large text, his name, his full name, his rank, his posting, his face, taken from his official service photo, which he had always thought made him look slightly confused. The anchor was explaining that the heir to the most powerful alien civilization in the Galactic Union had chosen a human border captain as her consort, based entirely on his battle report. The anchor used phrases like unprecedented, and galaxy-wide shock, and diplomatic implications. Jake set his spoon down very slowly. Katie Morgan was the first to speak. She looked at him with an expression that was halfway between amazement and amusement, and said, "Well, Captain, that is not what I expected to hear today." He closed it, opened it again, and said, "Is this real? Is this actually real?" Nate Holloway looked up from his technical manual, glanced at the screen, looked at Jake, and said, with the same tone he used when reporting on engine status, "Congratulations, Captain." Then the mess hall erupted. Every crew member was talking at once. Some were laughing, some were shouting. A few looked like they might cry, though they would deny it later. The news spread through the repair dock in minutes, and soon people who had nothing to do with Jake's crew were coming to the mess hall to look at him, as if he had suddenly become a different person than the man who had been quietly eating 5 minutes ago. Jake sat very still through all of it. He did not feel like a different person. He felt like a tired man with a sore shoulder who had just been told that his life was about to change in a way he could not control. The galaxy's reaction was immediate and enormous. Within hours, every news network in Union space was running the story. Commentators debated what it meant. Politicians calculated how it could benefit or harm them. The Aelanthe were the most powerful species in the Union, and a marriage between their heir and a human would shift the balance of power in ways that everyone wanted to exploit, and many wanted to prevent. Human governments were divided. Some were thrilled. An alliance with the Aelanthe through marriage would elevate humanity's standing in the Union by a century overnight. Others were worried. The attention was too much, the politics too dangerous, the risk of offending the Aelanthe if things went wrong too great. Military leaders debated whether Jake should be promoted immediately to make him look more impressive, or whether promoting him now would look desperate. Among the alien civilizations, the reaction was worse. The Rithian Compact, whose own candidate had been among Elindra's suitors, issued a formal statement expressing deep concern. The Thornari Federation called the choice an insult to established galactic traditions. Several species made it clear, through diplomatic channels and through louder public statements, that they considered humanity too young, too reckless, and too insignificant for this kind of alliance. Within the Elanthi sovereignty itself, the court was in upheaval. Elindra's declaration was legally binding, but that did not stop the opposition. Noble houses that had supported other suitors began forming alliances against the match. Political advisors warned that the human would embarrass the sovereignty. Military commanders questioned whether a captain who commanded a single frigate could stand beside the future ruler of a star-spanning empire. Sovereign Vasharine, Elindra's father, summoned her to a private meeting. What passed between them was not recorded, but those who saw Elindra afterward said she looked exactly the same as she had before, calm, certain, and completely unmoved. Jake, meanwhile, was dealing with a different kind of storm. The Union Diplomatic Corps contacted him within 12 hours, sending a team of advisors who descended on the repair dock like a flock of very well-dressed birds. They wanted to brief him on Elanthi customs, coach him on what to say in public, and manage his image for maximum political advantage. Jake listened to them politely for about 20 minutes. Then he told them, with the same calm tone he used on his bridge, that he appreciated their concern, but he was not going to let anyone manage his image, because he did not have an image. He was a captain. He had a crew. He had a job. And the rest of it was going to have to wait until he understood what was actually happening. The diplomats were horrified. They told him that this was the most significant political event in human history, and that his personal feelings were secondary to the needs of the species. Jake told them that he understood their point, but that he was not going to marry someone he had never met for political reasons, and if that made him a bad diplomat, then they should have sent a diplomat to the border station instead of him. That night, alone in his quarters on the repair dock, Jake sat in the dark and thought. He thought about the battle. He thought about the 13 people he had lost. He thought about the report he had written, and what it said about him, things he had put on paper because they were true, not because he expected anyone important to read them. And he thought about the princess who had read those words and seen something in them that made her stand before her entire civilization and choose him. He did not know what she looked like. He did not know the sound of her voice, or the way she laughed, or whether she laughed at all. He knew almost nothing about the Elanthi except what was in the cultural databases, and those were dry and clinical, and told him nothing about what it felt like to be one of them. But he knew one thing. She had chosen him because of a report in which he had told the complete truth about himself, including the parts that hurt. She had not chosen a version of him that was polished or prepared or designed to impress. She had chosen the real thing. That mattered to him. It mattered more than the politics, more than the galaxy's opinion, more than the pressure from every direction to be something other than what he was. He sat down at his desk and wrote a message. It was short, and he rewrote it 4 times before he was satisfied with it. It said, "Your Highness, I am honored beyond any words I have by your declaration. But I cannot in good conscience agree to a marriage with someone I have never met or spoken to. I mean no disrespect to you or your traditions. I am asking for something simple, a chance to meet you, not as a captain or a consort candidate, but as a person. If you are willing, I would be grateful." He sent it before he could talk himself out of it. The message crossed the galaxy in seconds. It reached the Elanthi court and was immediately intercepted by a dozen advisors who analyzed it for hidden meaning, political strategy, and diplomatic implications. Elindra read it alone, and for the first time since her declaration, she smiled. She sent back a single word. Yes, they chose a place that belonged to neither of them. a small garden station orbiting a quiet yellow star, halfway between human and Atlantis space. It was not a diplomatic facility or a military outpost. It was a botanical research station, built decades ago by a team of scientists who wanted to grow plants from different worlds in the same soil and see what happened. The result was a place filled with strange and beautiful gardens, where earth roses grew beside Atlantic crystal vines, and the air smelled like a dozen different homeworlds at once. Jake arrived first. He wore a clean uniform because that was what he had, but it was not his dress uniform. His dress uniform had been destroyed, along with most of his personal belongings, when a plasma fire tore through the officers' quarters during the 7th hour of the battle. He had considered requesting a new one, but it felt wrong, like putting on a costume to meet someone who had chosen him for being honest. He walked through the gardens alone, waiting. His shoulders still ached. The scar on his ribs pulled when he moved certain ways. He was nervous in a way that he had not been during the battle, because during the battle he had understood the situation. He had studied the enemy, run the simulations, and made his choices. This was different. He had no simulation for this. He had no tactical plan for meeting a woman who had decided to marry him based on the worst day of his life. Alindra arrived without escort. She had dismissed her guards at the docking port, ignoring their protests with a look that made it clear the discussion was over. She wore simple clothes, a long garment in deep blue that had no markings of rank or house. She had done this deliberately. She did not want the weight of her title to speak before she did. She was tall, taller than Jake by half a head. Her skin had the faint silver shimmer that all Alanthi carried, and her eyes were the color of deep water, with pupils that shifted shape when the light changed. Her hair was dark and long, and moved slightly even when there was no wind, because Alanthi hair responded to emotion the way a human's pulse responded to fear. But the thing Jake noticed first was not her appearance. It was the way she stood still when she saw him. Not frozen, but settled. The way a person stands when they have arrived somewhere they intended to be. They looked at each other across a garden path lined with flowers from 6 different worlds. "Captain Harris," she said. "Your Highness," he said. There was a pause. Then she said, "I would prefer Alindra, if that is acceptable." And he said, "Then I would prefer Jake." They began to walk, and they began to talk, and they did not stop for 7 hours. He told her about growing up in a small town in Colorado, a place with more sky than people. He told her about the first time he saw the stars through a telescope his mother gave him for his 12th birthday, and how something in his chest had opened up and never closed again. He told her about joining the fleet, about the years of being overlooked, about the border station that everyone considered a punishment, and that he had come to think of as a home, because his crew was there. She told him about the crystal halls where she had grown up, beautiful and cold and full of expectations. She told him about her mother, who had died when Alindra was young, and who had taught her to read battle reports the way other children were taught to read stories, looking not for what happened, but for who the person was behind what happened. She told him about the loneliness of being the heir, surrounded by people who wanted things from her, but never once asked what she wanted for herself. He told her about the battle, not the tactics or the strategy. She already knew those better than he did. He told her about the fear, about the moment before he gave the order to fight, when every part of his body wanted to run, and the only thing that kept him in his chair was the thought of the people behind him who could not run. He told her about the sounds the ship made when it was being torn apart, and how the worst sound was not the explosions, but the silence afterward, when he knew that the silence meant someone was gone. He told her about Vince Perry and Meg Saunders, the 2 crew members who had died because of his order. He told her their names, their faces, the things they had talked about during meals, and he told her what he had written in the report, that their deaths were his failure, and that he meant every word of it, and would mean it for the rest of his life. Alindra listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said something that Jake did not expect. You wrote that their deaths were your failure, but you also wrote that the decision was tactically justified at the time. Both things are true. The fact that you can hold both truths at once and not let either one destroy the other, that is why I chose you. Jake looked at her. Most people would tell me to forgive myself. Forgiveness is for those who failed through carelessness, she said. You failed through the impossible mathematics of war. You do not need forgiveness. You need someone who understands the weight you carry, and does not ask you to put it down, because putting it down would mean forgetting them. He did not speak for a moment. Then he said very quietly, No one has ever said that to me before. No one has ever needed to, she said. You have been carrying it alone. You do not have to anymore. They walked in silence through a garden, where earth sunflowers grew beside Alanthi light blooms that pulsed gently in the dark. After a while, he asked the question that had been sitting in him since the day her declaration made the news. Why me? And I do not mean the report. I mean me. I am a border captain. I have no political value. I have no wealth. I have a broken ship and a crew of 29 survivors, and a service record that nobody cared about until a month ago. Your civilization is 10,000 years old. You could choose anyone in the galaxy. Alindra stopped walking. She turned to face him, and her eyes, those deep water eyes that shifted with every change in light, were steady and serious. Because every other warrior I have studied fought to prove they were great. You fought to keep your people alive, and then you told the truth about the cost. That is not tactics. That is not luck. That is character. And character is the only thing that matters when you are choosing someone to stand beside you for the rest of your life. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer. I have been searching for a long time, Jake. I was beginning to believe that what I was looking for did not exist. And then I read your report, and I knew. Jake looked at her for a long moment. The garden was quiet around them. Somewhere, water moved over stones in a stream that wound between the flower beds. The light of the yellow star came through the station's transparent ceiling and fell on both of them. The same light, the same warmth. I am not a prince, he said. I am not a diplomat. I am probably going to make mistakes that will horrify your entire court. Yes, she said, you will, and I will make mistakes that will confuse your entire species. That is what happens when two people try to build something real. He almost smiled. That is the most honest thing anyone has said to me since Katie Morgan told me I'd better not embarrass my crew. Alindra's hair moved slightly, which Jake would later learn was the Alanthi equivalent of a laugh. I think I will like Katie Morgan. When they emerged from the garden station, the galaxy was waiting. News ships hovered at a respectful distance. Diplomatic channels were burning with speculation. Rival factions in the Alanthi court had spent the day preparing new arguments against the match. Human politicians had drafted 17 different statements depending on the outcome. Jake and Alindra stood together and faced the cameras and the questions and the noise. They did not make grand political statements. Jake spoke about his crew, about what they had taught him about courage, and about what it meant to protect something larger than yourself. Alindra spoke about her tradition, about reading souls through deeds, and about finding in a human captain the heart she had spent her life searching for. The galaxy listened, and something shifted. In the months that followed, the wedding took place on a station built for the occasion, positioned at the midpoint between Earth and the Alanthi homeworld. The ceremony blended human and Alanthi traditions. Jake's surviving crew stood at his side, wearing new uniforms that the Union had finally provided. Katie Morgan served as his witness, and threatened to end him if he stumbled over his vows. Danny Cole cried and pretended he did not. Nate Holloway stood quietly at the back and smiled. Sovereign Vasharin, who had opposed the match and argued against it and tried every legal avenue to delay it, walked his daughter down the aisle. When he placed her hand in Jake's, he looked the human in the eye and said, "Take care of her." And Jake, who had faced an invasion swarm without flinching, felt his voice shake when he said, "I will." The alliance that followed changed the galaxy. Human creativity and Elanthe wisdom forged a partnership that reshaped the Union. The Vrikari were pushed back for the first time in 2 centuries. New corridors of space were opened. Species that had dismissed humanity began to see them differently, not because of politics or military power, but because of a story about a forgotten captain who stood his ground and told the truth, and a princess who read his words and recognized the man she had been waiting for. Years later, when historians wrote about the moment that changed everything, they always came back to the same scene. A quiet room in a crystal palace. A woman reading a battle report. A line in that report that said, "This failure is mine, and I will carry it forward." And a decision, spoken to an empty chamber, that echoed across the stars. "I will wed this man."